We've just got some breaking news in from Buckingham Palace, folks. So this statement has just come in from Buckingham Palace, and I'll read it for you. It goes on to say, His Majesty has today initiated a formal process to remove the style, titles, and...
The council chamber at Aldervane Castle had not been used in 9 years. Its doors were oak reinforced with iron, its walls lined with portraits of monarchs long dead, and its air carried the particular stillness of a room built for decisions too heavy for ordinary corridors. On the morning the decree was read, that stillness broke. King Edmund entered first, followed by his wife, Queen Consort Rosalind, then Crown Prince Alastair, and finally Princess Margarethe, the late Queen Isolde's second child and the kingdom's Princess Royal. Behind them came the royal archivist, a woman named Constance Fairweather, carrying a black lacquered case sealed with the personal wax stamp of the late queen. No one in the room had seen that stamp broken in over a decade. Rosalind had braced herself for many things in the months since Isolde's death. She had prepared for the cold looks from courtiers who still called her the second wife in private. She had prepared for newspapers that dredged up every scandal from her past. She had even prepared, in her quieter moments, for the possibility that the old guard within the household would never fully accept her. What she had not prepared for was a command written by Isolde herself, sealed years before her death, waiting for this exact morning. Constance broke the wax seal with a small silver blade kept for that sole purpose. Inside was a single folded document, its paper yellowed slightly at the edges, its ink faded but legible. She read it aloud in a flat, careful voice, the voice of someone who had rehearsed this moment many times without ever expecting to perform it. The decree was brief. It declared that Rosalind, Queen Consort of Aldervane, was to be denied entry to every official residence under Crown control: the castle itself, the summer estate at Brannock, the hunting lodge at Fenmore, and the ceremonial townhouse in the capital, unless 3 specific conditions, sealed in a second document, were met in full. Rosalind did not argue. She did not raise her voice or demand an explanation. She simply went very still, staring at the paper as though staring hard enough might rearrange its words into something survivable. Royal privilege, she was learning in real time, could be revoked as completely as it had once been granted. Edmund's hands tightened on the arms of his chair, but he said nothing. Alastair, seated closest to the archivist, leaned forward to examine the page more closely. The document carried Isolde's personal seal and 2 witness signatures, proof it had been drafted and sealed well before her death, not some hurried decision made in her final days. A note at the bottom indicated the order would only activate once a specific condition, detailed in a second sealed file, had been satisfied. What triggered it? Alastair asked quietly, addressing Constance rather than his father. Constance reached back into the case and withdrew a second file, smaller than the first, marked for the eyes of the sovereign and the heir alone. Margarethe reached for it before anyone else could, but it was Rosalind who spoke first, her voice low and unsteady. Did Isolde write this years ago and simply wait, she asked, or did someone in this room decide today was the day to use it? No one answered her directly, but before the room could begin to unpack the decree's origins, each person present had to reckon with what they personally stood to lose now that the doors had, in effect, already closed. The decree did more than bar Rosalind from a handful of buildings. It cracked open every strained relationship holding the family together. Edmund faced the particular humiliation of watching his wife rejected by his late mother from beyond the grave, with no way to argue back against a woman who could no longer be argued with. Alastair found himself dragged into a decision tangled up with resentments he'd carried since he was a boy watching his father's second marriage reshape the household he grew up in. Margarethe, ever her mother's daughter, felt the weight of being the one entrusted to guard Isolde's final wishes. And Rosalind, for all her titles and years of ceremony, understood in that chamber that none of it could protect her from being treated, quite suddenly, like an outsider. She followed Edmund into the private corridor once the council adjourned for the morning, the silence between them heavier than the sealed file left behind on the table. For years he had fought, through scandal, through public disapproval, through his own mother's quiet disapproval, to secure Rosalind's place beside him. Now the decree threatened something larger than which room she could enter. It raised the question of whether the institution he'd been born to serve had ever truly accepted her at all. She stopped him before he could turn back toward the chamber. "Did you know about this?" Edmund looked at her, then at the closed door behind them, and the half-second of hesitation before he answered told her more than any denial could have. He admitted, eventually, that his mother had once warned him certain restrictions might outlive her. But he insisted, just as firmly, that he had never seen the final document. The answer came a beat too slowly to be entirely convincing, and Rosalind's expression hardened as she realized he had suspected something and let her walk into that chamber unprepared anyway. Back in the council room, Alistair sat with the second file still unopened in front of him, wrestling with a different kind of discomfort. As heir, he was expected to uphold his grandmother's formal wishes without question. But the decree also pulled him back toward older wounds, his mother's memory, his father's choices in the years after her death, and the slow, uncomfortable process of watching Rosalind's position in the family grow over time. He wanted accountability, not revenge. But in that room, the line between the two had never felt thinner. Margarethe kept one hand pressed flat against the folder, remembering something her mother used to say often in her final years, that royal residences belonged to the crown, not to whoever happened to be living in them at the time. As Princess Royal, Margarethe felt the particular grief of being the one left to carry out her mother's final instruction, tangled together with something closer to anger, that Rosalind's choices had put the family in this position at all. She looked toward her father, hoping he might say something to ease the tension in the room. He couldn't meet her eyes. It was Constance, the archivist, who eventually broke the quiet, presenting a household record she had prepared for the council's review. 6 months before her death, she explained, Isolde had quietly ordered a full inventory. Access passes, private keys, staff assignments, and living arrangements connected to Rosalind's household. It had been done discreetly, Constance said, because the late queen suspected someone was accumulating authority faster than it had been formally granted. Alistair remembered, then, a conversation from years earlier at the Fenmore Lodge, one he hadn't fully understood at the time. His grandmother had told him that a palace becomes dangerous the moment personal entitlement gets mistaken for constitutional right. He hadn't known who she meant back then. He understood now. Margarethe opened the second file. On the first page was a handwritten date, the date of a private ceremony at Fenmore that the family had spent years quietly keeping out of any official record. It wasn't a minor family disagreement. It was, according to the file, the exact moment Isolde decided Rosalind could never again be trusted with unrestricted access to the crown's most protected spaces. Years before any of them sat in that chamber, one quiet evening at Fenmore had changed everything. There had been no cameras that night, no public announcement, nothing but a locked reception room, a guest list nobody had approved, and a ceremonial gesture that had never received the sign-off it required. By the following morning, Isolde had reached a private conclusion she shared with almost no one, that the greatest threat to the household's order wasn't coming from outside its walls. It was already living inside them. The gathering at Fenmore had been arranged not long after a significant royal anniversary. Isolde had expected a quiet family evening, no speeches, no talk of succession, nothing beyond a simple dinner among relatives. Instead, she found the household staff arranged in a formal receiving line while Rosalind directed them through what she referred to, in front of everyone, as a household transfer ceremony. It had no official sanction whatsoever. Isolde entered the drawing room to find Rosalind mid-instruction, informing senior staff that her personal directions should, going forward, carry the same weight as instructions from the sovereign herself. Isolde dismissed every member of staff on the spot. She waited until the door closed behind the last of them before asking, quite plainly, who had authorized any of it. Rosalind's answer was that she was simply preparing the household for a future she believed was coming soon. A future where Edmund, given his health, would need faster decisions and stronger support around him. Isolde set down the gloves she'd been holding and answered with a controlled, deliberate fury. The future was not Rosalind's to assign. Rosalind tried to explain further, but Isolde's attention had already shifted to something more troubling sitting open on the side table, a restricted residence ledger, the kind of internal document the Royal Archives never approved for removal. It contained emergency access procedures for every major crown property. Isolde asked, simply, how it had ended up in that room. Rosalind had no clear answer, and that silence was the moment, more than any argument, when trust between them fully broke down. Before midnight, Isolde had summoned Margaretti and 2 constitutional advisors. In a record later preserved alongside the second sealed file, she dictated the first draft of what would eventually become the decree. A declaration that any future attempt to claim residence authority without the sovereign's direct approval would result in Rosalind being permanently barred from every crown-controlled home. Margaretti, hearing each word, understood even then that her mother wasn't acting out of jealousy. She was building a safeguard. Back in the present, Alistair turned the final page of the file and found the detail that changed the tone of the entire room. The Fenmore incident wasn't ancient history being dredged up for effect. A nearly identical instruction had been issued only days before this council meeting, directing staff to route residents' decisions through Rosalind's private office. This time, it carried her own signature. Alistair placed the newly signed order in front of Rosalind without raising his voice, which somehow made the moment land harder than shouting could have. No one in the room moved. Edmund watched his son. Margaretti watched her brother. And Rosalind stared down at the page as though she might, through sheer will, refused to recognize her own signature. Did you sign this knowing the authority was never yours to claim? Alistair asked. The order instructed staff at 3 separate residences to route every decision about rooms, records, and access through Rosalind's office, effectively placing her household above the established chain of command. It had only come to light because a longtime security officer at Fenmore refused to hand over a restricted access register without verification and sent the request directly to Alistair instead. Rosalind read her own signature twice, then pushed her chair back with a sharp scrape against the stone floor. She insisted the document had been drafted by an aide and placed in front of her during a rushed morning briefing, that she'd signed it without fully absorbing what it said. Alistair pointed to a handwritten note beside her signature, the handwriting a clear match for notes found in her own private office. An aide, he said, hadn't written that. She had. Edmund finally broke his silence, accusing his son of turning what he called an administrative misstep into a public reckoning, and warning the room that they had already decided Rosalind's guilt before hearing her side. Alistair didn't back down. His grandmother had created the consequence, he said. Rosalind had created the reason for it. Edmund turned to his wife, waiting for a denial firm enough to end the argument. None came. Margaretti opened the original Fenmore ledger and set it beside the new order, the same restricted document containing emergency entry procedures Isolde had discovered years earlier. The repetition was impossible to explain away as coincidence. Rosalind's composure finally cracked. She admitted she had wanted more direct authority during the periods when Edmund's health had made quick decisions difficult, when staff had been left uncertain and responsibilities had gone unclaimed. She denied ever intending to override the sovereign's position. But her own admission confirmed what the room already suspected. She had knowingly expanded her authority without seeking formal approval for it. The line between supporting her husband and quietly assuming control on his behalf had grown dangerously thin. Edmund rose and demanded the decree be cancelled immediately. He was king, he reminded them, and no order concerning his wife should be able to stand against his word. But the family's constitutional secretary, present for exactly this possibility, closed the folder in front of her before responding. Isolde, she explained, had anticipated precisely this reaction. Edmund wasn't merely one voice among several who could overturn the decree. He was, deliberately, the one person his mother had made sure couldn't undo it alone. The secretary explained that the properties in question were held under a mix of legal, hereditary, and institutional arrangements. Some belonged outright to the crown. Some were private but ceremonially significant. Others existed purely for official functions. Isolde had used those distinctions deliberately, weaving synchronized restrictions across every category so that no single loophole could reopen access once the decree activated. She read the chain of authority aloud. Margaretti held temporary enforcement power as custodian of her mother's instructions. Alistair held authority as heir. Edmund remained the final witness, but no individual, not even the king, could cancel the order alone. Isolde had made collective responsibility deliberately stronger than personal loyalty. Edmund read the clause twice, then removed his glasses and set them down without a word. His shoulders dropped as the full weight of it settled on him. His mother had expected he might try to defend his wife. Even at the cost of the very boundary she believed the crown needed to survive. Rosalind watched his face closely, searching for some flicker of resistance. She found only resignation. Margaretti turned to her brother and spoke with quiet conviction. Enforcing the decree wasn't an attack on Rosalind, she said. It was honoring their mother's final protective act. Edmund answered that duty felt very different when it meant removing someone from rooms she'd called home for years. Margaretti didn't soften. Those rooms, she reminded him, had never truly belonged to any one person, however long they'd lived in them. A recorded statement from Isolde was played for the room, her voice explaining, plainly, that residents' access meant practical power. Control over rooms meant control over staff, schedules, private audiences, correspondence, the actual physical machinery of the crown. Whoever controlled the residences, she warned, could quietly begin controlling far more than that. Rosalind was given one final condition. Limited access could eventually be restored, but only if she surrendered every unofficial key in her possession, dissolved her independent household office entirely, and formally acknowledged that any authority she held came through the sovereign, not beside him. Before Edmund could respond, the door opened. An aide entered with an urgent update from Fenmore. Enforcement had already begun. The first sign of Rosalind's fall wasn't a public statement. It was the quiet removal of her name from a staff access board. Then came the locked cabinets, the canceled instructions, the correspondence packed away, the keys collected one by one. By the time she arrived at Fenmore that afternoon, the residence she'd entered for years no longer recognized her authority. The building hadn't changed. It had simply stopped opening its doors for her. Security staff had already received formal instructions. Rosalind could not enter any official residence without written approval from all 3 custodians named in the decree, ensuring no single act of sympathy could quietly reopen what the council had closed. Her office was suspended. Meetings were reassigned. Her belongings were prepared for transfer to a private property Edmund owned outside Crown control. She approached the Fenmore entrance and presented the access card she'd carried for years. The light above the reader flashed red. She tried again, holding the card a beat longer, as though patience alone might undo the council's decision. The light stayed red. A security officer stepped forward and explained, as gently as the situation allowed, that her access had been revoked 20 minutes earlier. She lowered her hand. The humiliation of the moment reached everyone standing nearby. She was shown to a temporary sitting room outside the residence's secured boundary, where she watched staff carry boxes of letters, photographs, and personal belongings toward a waiting car. Her anger gave way, slowly, to something colder, the particular shock of watching a life reduced to labeled containers because the institution she'd married into no longer recognized her authority within it. One box held a sealed envelope addressed to her directly. Rosalind opened it and recognized Isolde's handwriting immediately. The message was short, that she had always belonged to the family, but was never meant to possess the institution itself. She read it twice before folding it with unsteady hands. There was no cruelty in it, only a boundary, which somehow made it harder to argue with. An aide later informed her that Edmund had been offered the option of delaying the removals until the following morning, and had declined, after hearing the recording of his mother's warning played back to him. Rosalind absorbed the news in silence. She had expected, at minimum, one final night before the doors closed. Instead, they closed before sunset. Edmund arrived at the private residence that evening, dismissed the staff, and closed the door behind him. Rosalind didn't rise to greet him. He sat across from her and said they were finally going to have the one honest conversation their marriage had never quite managed. Stripped of the residences, the titles, the advisors hovering nearby, there was nothing left between them except the truth they both spent years avoiding. He admitted he had spent decades believing loyalty meant shielding her from every attack, public criticism, family resistance, the long shadow of his first marriage. But the decree had forced him to confront something harder. That protection, taken too far, becomes its own kind of danger because it removes accountability entirely. The crown required judgment, not blind devotion. One private exception left unchecked could quietly erode every rule holding the institution together. Rosalind answered with something closer to exhausted honesty than defensiveness. Edmund's health problems and packed schedule, she said, had left staff uncertain and decisions stalled for too long. She believed someone needed to act quickly when formal channels moved too slowly, and had convinced herself that decisiveness was a form of service rather than overreach. Edmund asked the question he suspected she'd been avoiding. Would she ever have given up the independent household office voluntarily? Rosalind looked away and said nothing for a long moment. The silence answered before she finally admitted, quietly, that she'd come to believe her position entitled her to keep it, that after years of enduring public judgment to stand beside him, endurance had slowly started to feel like ownership. He responded without anger. Marriage had made her his partner, he said. It had never made the residences theirs. Rosalind began to cry, not over the lost rooms or staff, but from the realization that he wasn't going to overturn his mother's judgment. For the first time in their relationship, Edmund was choosing the institution over the instinct that had guided every decision he'd made about her for decades. She reached into her bag and produced the one unofficial master key she'd kept since the Fenmore incident, admitting she'd assumed the old restrictions would eventually fade on their own. She set it on the table between them, and the small sound it made marked the end of her resistance. Edmund called Alastair and Margaretti that same night. He confirmed the decree would remain fully in effect, and that he would sign the enforcement record without requesting a single exception. Alastair answered quietly. Margaretti said nothing for several seconds before thanking her brother for holding the line their mother had drawn. By the next morning, word of the decree had spread beyond the family. The public story became less about locked doors and access cards and more about what those closed doors seemed to represent, a boundary the late queen had drawn and made sure would outlast her. The palace released a brief statement confirming that Rosalind would no longer perform official duties from crown-controlled properties. Commentary was, for the most part, restrained. Constitutional observers were careful to note the restriction concerned access and authority, not the marriage itself. Alastair watched the first reports with his wife beside her, aware that some would frame him as the son who'd helped push his father's wife out of the family home, even though he'd simply carried out an instruction written years before he had any say in it. Rosalind eventually issued her own statement, read through a spokesperson. She accepted the decree, surrendered every remaining key and access privilege, and acknowledged publicly that the residences belonged to the duty of the crown, not to personal ambition. She didn't contest the decision or place blame on those who'd enforced it. The tone of public reaction shifted after that, not toward celebration, but toward something quieter, closer to resolution. In the end, Rosalind didn't lose her marriage, her title, or her place in Edmund's private life. She lost something more specific, the belief that closeness to the crown could, over time, become ownership of it. Isolde's decree drew a final, deliberate line between marriage and authority, affection and access, presence and power. When Rosalind handed over that last key, the crisis didn't end with anyone winning. It ended with the quiet, uncomfortable recognition that an institution like this only survives when even the people closest to it accept where its boundaries sit. Edmund signed the final enforcement record first. Alastair signed beneath him. Margaretti added her name last, and the document became official, permanently limiting Rosalind's presence in crown residences to rare, pre-approved ceremonial occasions. Margaretti personally oversaw the closure of Rosalind's independent office. Staff reassigned, passes canceled, every remaining key returned. She checked each item carefully, aware that influence tends to start small and expand quietly, until no one quite remembers where the original line used to be. Edmund chose to protect his marriage without asking the institution to bend around it again. He told Rosalind he would remain beside her privately, but would never again ask the crown to make room for an exception on her behalf. He spoke with sadness rather than resentment, and she understood, finally, that he wasn't abandoning her. He was simply separating love from authority, something he probably should have done years earlier. Rosalind accepted the outcome without further argument. In a private conversation with Alistair some weeks later, she admitted she'd mistaken endurance for entitlement, that surviving years of public scrutiny had convinced her, gradually, that she'd earned more control than she'd actually been given. Alistair didn't forgive every wound in that conversation, but he acknowledged the honesty in her admission. For the first time, neither of them used the past as a weapon against the other. Isolde's decree stopped being viewed within the family as an act of posthumous punishment. It became something closer to a safeguard, a mechanism built specifically to prevent private influence from quietly overtaking public duty. She had understood, long before any of them, that physical access creates influence, influence creates control, and control can hollow out an institution without a single public announcement ever being made. Margarethe carried the original decree into the royal archives herself and sealed it beside the surrendered master key. Proof, together, that even the greatest personal privilege ends where institutional duty begins.